phrase comes to mind. It's complicated. That can be the kind of wry answer to a question about a human relationship, right? Maybe a romantic relationship, or sometimes just a family relationship, or a friendship, whatever. Maybe things started well, but now there is a kind of mix of good and bad, of tension as well as attraction, and jealousy as well as kindness and support, and dishonesty, but aspects of fidelity. It's complicated. And it may be the way also to express God's relationship with human beings. The whole history of salvation, as indicated by the Easter Vigil readings, has this complication as a backdrop. Now, it's all on our side. God's love is constant, but it is we who are complicated by our capriciousness, and to be sure, the difficulty of living lives of faith on earth. But it is our sinfulness and infidelity that causes the complication. We rebel, deny, hide, you name it. And the resurrection of Jesus, which we celebrate now, is the ultimate answer to that complication. In human relationships, it can be hard to solve those complications. That word, complication, means something like folded in on itself, in its root meaning from Latin. You could say knotted up. So Jesus, through coming to be with us, through dying and then ultimately rising from the dead, has untied the knot of our human complications. As with everyday complicated relationships, we could lament that our relationship with God started so beautifully. And we who read the scriptures do lament that. And so there was that first reading, the story of creation. And at the end, God looked at everything he had made, and he found it very good. Think of just the beauty of what God has done, and crowned it with physical creation, with the creation of human beings who were made in his image and likeness. And he called this original situation Eden, some kind of situation of perfection and of love, of peace, of joy. There was no evil originally, no complication in the early days of the world. Adam and Eve were at peace with God and with one another. The beauty of creation sang the praises of God just by its existence. There was what the theologians call original justice, beauty, goodness, harmony, love, all good. Now, it's no longer that way, and Genesis goes on to describe the origin and the fall, this mysterious and lamentable act of disobedience, in the guilt of which we all share in some way in original sin. But despite the fall, we still feel echoes, a sense of that original Eden. It wasn't like it turned everything bad. It introduced evil into the world, but the good and the beauty is still there. Literally, the birds sing. Maybe you've noticed that during these days of pandemic, you can still hear that singing, that lovely singing, increasing as we move into spring. They don't know about the pandemic. The flowers bloom. As the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins put it in his poem, God's Grandeur, there lives the dearest freshness, deep down things. Human beings, also with our weakness and selfishness indeed, still exhibit nobility. We are still made in God's image. So we therefore long for the redemption, the return almost to that justice. Now there's a darkness over the world, darkness of sin, but also, especially these days, of the pandemic. How it seems to emphasize the effects of evil in the world. We are banished, not from Eden per se, although we are still, but from our regular lives and from each other. We see each other, and with some reason at last, as agents of infection, which itself is a kind of metaphor of human sin. We can corrupt one another. That's possible. It's not necessary, but it's possible. But from this darkness will come light. Just as the Easter Vigil, we light the Easter candle, and that dark night gives way to the dawn of Easter Sunday morning. We celebrate restoration and salvation in Easter. We boldly proclaim and they exalt it at the Easter Vigil, the sin of Adam to be a happy fault that earns so great, so glorious a Redeemer. That's exaltation, when we can look at that one tragic event and say it was meant to be and it brought us something greater than the evil that it caused. So we can pray, therefore, always. That prayer, that expression of faith with evil, and that this pandemic may also be a happy fault. We don't say it lightly. We're just as we don't lightly brush aside the death of Jesus. We commemorate that and honor it on Good Friday and through Holy Week. And we don't lightly say, may this pandemic be a happy fault, but still we have faith that God can turn this evil into something good. Perhaps greater solidarity among peoples. Let us think of the lessons we're learning. A stronger faith in God as we are alone with God, so many of us. A greater care for our common home, this earth. The history of salvation is the story of God healing the complication. That story of salvation begins with Abraham, our father in faith. Sometimes we humans choose to end a complication by ending the relationship. I don't want any more of that story. But God does not do that. He enters into history. He engages us. He asks our cooperation. He does not destroy or force, but engages our freedom and our faith. And in this case, he chooses someone who believes in him. This amazing biblical character of Abraham, called from Ur of the Chaldees to go forward. In Abraham's trial, when he is asked to sacrifice his only son, who was the son of his old age, you remember Isaac, the fruit of the promise, Abraham must have been so bewildered. But he exhibits an uncomplicated, even if painful, faith. He will trust God above all. I don't know where this is leading or exactly why, but I believe in God. And in so doing, he will find out that God means to bless us abundantly, not take away. That's the great mystery. We think that when we believe, when we put ourselves in God's hands, when we do as he wishes, that he wishes, that he's taking things away from us. But not so at all. Jesus talks about the 100-fold. If we give ourselves to God like Abraham did, he had descendants greater than the stars in the sky. And the Lord will likewise bless each child in faith. Later, God's own son will be led up a hill with wood on his back for a much greater sacrifice, to give us all the gift of that same faith that Abraham had. God then, in that next reading, delivers the Israelites through the Red Sea from the complication of slavery and repression in Egypt. They will be able to worship him freely in their own land after a considerable test Indeed, in the rigors of the desert, they will forget what it was like to be slaves and want to go back. Likewise, we desire sometimes to return to the complications of sin and of selfishness, of turning in on ourselves and turning out the world and the Lord. But God draws us onward to the promised land of grace and holiness. In that case, the people of Israel together, led by Moses, and us, the community of the church, which calls us onward to in our pilgrimage of faith. Israel is the type, indeed, of the church, called now to the promised land of grace and holiness. Ezekiel prophesies a marvelous resolution to the complication that still must have seemed difficult to understand in the days when he spoke it, and only in retrospect do we understand. I will sprinkle clean water upon you to cleanse you from all your iniquities. He had just cataloged in that prophecy Israel's ongoing rebellion against the Lord. If we read the Old Testament, there's a kind of tendency, a regular tendency to turn from the Lord, even though they are God's chosen, and turn to idolatry. And he does not prophesy some sort of terrible vengeance or vindictiveness on God, but rather this mysterious cleansing with water, sprinkling waters. God will indeed change them internally so that holiness will well up from within, as we see it now, baptism. The complication, the trouble, the knot, is overcome today, on Easter Day. Christ has risen, and we are set free. He took on our nature and joined our messy lot. In his flesh, he overcame oppression, violence, hypocrisy. We know that Christ, raised from the dead, dies no more, St. Paul says. So all of that messiness, he accepted on himself and overcame. He has taken on our great enemies, sin and death and sadness, ignorance. The very fiercest aspects of our human dysfunction were aimed directly at him on the cross. Do not be afraid, the angel cries to Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Jesus has won the victory. Do not be afraid and do not cry. Think of the other characters as well, all of the characters in the gospel story. He raises up and heals the little people of the world, indeed like Mary Magdalene, a nobody from whom the Lord had expelled 7 devils, according to the Gospels. He heals the complications of her life to make of her a great witness. He will strengthen the failing hearts of those who are well-meaning but afraid, like the apostles. Isn't that such a human affliction? The good that we would do, we do not do. And God heals that. If then we have died with Christ, St. Paul says, we believe we shall also live with him. We are baptized into Jesus' death and resurrection. The battle completed in heaven is already won if we but continue to live our faith. The resurrection of Christ through baptism is within each one of us, those sprinkled waters that bring us a new heart. In our places of quarantine and in hospitals and in the essential workplaces where people go sometimes at risk to themselves, the resurrection of Christ is present. Do not be afraid, Jesus repeats to the 2 women. Go tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. God heals our relationships with him and with one another. And all we have to do is